It's a great pleasure for me to be here and talk to you a little bit about what I do, what the agency I represent does, what the commission does. So I'll try and talk a little bit about that. I have some things that I want to talk about with the approach generally that we take to nuclear regulation and nuclear power. When I do that, normally I kind of have a presentation that I give to audiences like this. I'll add this with some differences that are a little bit more focused on what's happening in Japan and try and bring some of that more to point. I'll try not to talk too long and give you all an opportunity then to ask questions, because I have a sense that may be the more interesting part of the discussion. Often it is for me, and then I'll know for sure I'm talking about the things that you're interested in. I thought I'd start just a little bit of an overview, and we heard that from the Dean about the agency and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We are an agency that's headed by a 5-person commission. Right now we have a tremendously strong group of individuals, which is extremely important given the work that we'll have in front of us to address lessons learned coming out of the situation in Japan. We've grown over the last several years to accommodate new expectations for new work and new activities, mostly centered around the potential for new nuclear licensing and construction in this country. As a result, our budget has grown as well. We're a little bit over $1 billion, and that's been somewhere we've been roughly stable for the last several years. And as you heard, we were created in 1954, originally as the Atomic Energy Commission, and then over time, as people recognized that there maybe needed to be a separation between the promotional part of nuclear power development and the regulatory part, they ultimately created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and abolished the Atomic Energy Commission. At that time, perhaps a forgotten agency was created, which was the Energy Resource and Development Agency, or administration, known as ERDA. That ultimately became the Department of Energy. So the original split was to create ERDA and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And we were given the primary responsibility, or the only responsibility really, for the agency to regulate nuclear power. And that change happened in 1974. So it was almost 2 decades after the original creation of the Atomic Energy Commission. The agency's focus, as I said, fundamentally is on protecting the public health and safety, promoting common defense and security in the use of nuclear materials and nuclear power, and then ultimately protecting the environment. And that's probably one of those last 2 areas are probably the things that we often have the most discussion and deliberation about. They're probably the least used aspects of our authority. The first one, I put it here in the condensed version, of protecting public health and safety. But when Congress established the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they gave us a very specific responsibility when it came to protecting public health and safety. And generally, we refer to it as reasonable assurance of adequate protection. And I always like to think of that as Congress did a very nice thing, and they handed us this wonderfully sounding phrase that seems reasonable. Of course, it has the word reasonable in it, and seems simple and straightforward. And for the last 30-some years, 35 years, the agency's been trying to figure out what reasonable assurance of adequate protection really means. So I'm going to try and talk to you a little bit and give you a sense of what I think that means and how we're trying to define those terms in a way that's objective and that we can apply to situations in a consistent way. So the major things we do, as we're a regulatory body, we do licensing, we do oversight, we write rules, we do some research, and probably the last one, which is one of the areas that doesn't get as much profile, is we do incident response, and that's something we're heavily engaged in right now, assisting our colleagues in Japan. I give you this picture. The pictures you see there, I think, are a good reflection and representation of some of the things that we do. We're generally known for nuclear power plants and the work we do regulating nuclear power plants, but we have a lot of other responsibilities. We deal with radiation sources, and you'll see there's an indication there of an individual in the hard hat. A lot of construction sites use sources that are regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or through a program by a state that is closely modeled after the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's programs. So we do a lot of other things in areas beyond nuclear power regulation, but that is often the most high profile. And when you look at our budget is really dominated by the work we do on the nuclear power side. My background, as you heard, is in science predominantly, so I always like to have a slide about where we fit in the federal government. I didn't take a lot of, after I got out of high school, I didn't take a lot of government classes or history classes or things like that, so I always feel like I'm always falling back on Schoolhouse Rock as to what we do and where we fit in the federal government. And of course, they all teach you, and unless you take more advanced classes in government, they teach you about 3 branches of government: the judicial, the executive, the legislative. They don't teach you about the independent regulatory commissions. So it's an interesting debate and discussion about where we fit. The obvious answer in a way is that we're in the executive branch, but that's not really the case because we're an independent regulatory agency. So we fit somewhere kind of in a way in the middle of all of those. We are ultimately an agency that has some judicial type functions. For those of you who pay attention to these things, for instance, decisions of the commission get appealed directly to the circuit court rather than going to district court. So to some extent, the agency's decision making is almost like a district court in the federal court system, although we're not a court by any means. We have executive type functions, in particular dealing with foreign counterparts. We work very closely with the executive branch on those issues. But predominantly, the work we do is really an extension of legislative authority. Which is not necessarily, I think, the obvious answer that most people would have, but realistically, we are kind of a quasi-legislative body that works to carry out this legislative mandate of reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. This is, I think, a very interesting collection of quotes. There's a lot of interesting history in all of these quotes, and some things that, for those of you who follow the nuclear power industry very closely, the first one in particular is a very controversial one, and I'll talk to you about why that is. Lewis Strauss was, I believe, the first, or one of the early chairmen of the Atomic Energy Commission, and he gave a speech in 1954, and he was talking about, at that time, the potential research, or the potential development of electricity production in this country. Electricity everywhere, power plants everywhere, and what that would mean for the country. And he had this very famous quote about, "Our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter." Now, as the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, that quote has often been conflated with nuclear power. And the mythology that's developed was that the quote was that nuclear power will ultimately be too cheap to meter, which brings us to a quote in 2001 from The Economist magazine, which I think was actually, I think it's a great line. But that says that once claimed too cheap to be metered, which actually wasn't claimed, nuclear power is now too expensive to matter. And that was a statement in 2001. And there was a lot of talk then about the possibility of new licensing and new reactors. But at that time, the thought was that it was just very much too expensive. It wasn't something that was going to be viable. Fast forward to the present, about 6 or 7 years after that quote, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission saw a flood of new license applications coming into the agency. At one time, we had 18 applications for new power reactors with the agency. That number's down a little bit now to about 12 that we're working on. So you had this period in between 1954 and 2001 where a lot of things happened. And what I'm going to try and do is focus on those things that happened there and then talk a little bit about what happens in 2011 and beyond. And I want to start, always is the best place to start is in the past. And one of the things that I'll try and walk you through is how we learned as an agency to do things much better. And the key to a lot of that was putting a more disciplined and more scientifically rigorous approach to analyzing nuclear risk and nuclear hazards. And that's something we continue to work on today and continues to be an activity today. if you think about the historical approach to licensing and oversight, it really rests on 5 fundamental criteria. And if you're watching the situation in Japan closely, you'll see these things playing themselves out in a very specific way. The first one is deterministic. We've got specific standards, specific requirements that plants have to meet. They have to have so many diesel generators to provide electricity in the event that you lose electrical power. Those diesel generators have to be able to supply a certain amount of power in order to supply electrical energy to certain types of equipment. There have to be so many pumps that can perform a specific function. So it was a very deterministic approach to looking at things. We had to have defense in depth, namely that if one system fails, there would be another type of system, another way to solve that same problem. We had to have redundancy. If there was one pump to do something, you wanted to have a second pump in case the first pump failed. You had to have diversity. So if you needed to get water into the reactor core, there had to be different ways to get water into the reactor core. And finally, you had to have single failure criteria, namely that there couldn't be one thing that would disable all of your systems at the same time. So you wanted to ensure that if something happened, it was only going to take out one of these diverse systems or one of the redundant aspects of your design. So, you know, it's good to have all of these first 4 criteria, but if there's one thing that can wipe them all out, then your system doesn't work. So the key piece of that was the single failure criteria. Now, if you look at the situation in Japan, what we've seen is challenges to all of these systems. And ultimately, in a way, what we've seen is a single failure point of vulnerability. And right now, that appears to be largely centered around the tsunami that occurred at the plant. So this was the historical way that we looked at licensing. We came up with these very important criteria, and then we built in these systems that we thought would capture everything. And where we missed something, we thought we would make it redundant enough that it would then capture the things we didn't know about. But that's difficult. It's difficult to do because sometimes we don't know everything, and there are things that we may miss. And those are the kinds of lessons that we learn from events like this. And I'll give you an example. One of the key pieces of our regulatory program and how we've developed over the years is this idea of operational experience. So when something happens, we want to learn from it. We want to make the program better. A significant incident happened in 1975 with a fire at a nuclear power plant. It's known as Brown's Ferry. It's owned by the Tennessee Valley Authority. I still find this somewhat incredible, but this was actually true. The way this fire started, in nuclear power plants, they have all these electrical equipment, but you also have rooms that are sealed and have to be kind of leak tight for air. You don't want air to go in and out and things like that. And those areas are the areas that if you had an accident, those areas would contain the nuclear material so that it wouldn't get out into the environment. Well, of course, these things aren't totally isolated. They have power cables that run in and out, all kinds of other things that go in and out. So you have these areas where there's connections. Well, in 1975, they were doing a test for the leak tightness of this structure. And the way that was done was you take a flame and you hold it up to the openings, and if there's any air movement, the flame will move back and forth, and then you know you've got a penetration. Okay? Thinking back, open flames not necessarily the smartest thing to have around electrical equipment. And in fact, what happened was some cable caught on fire because of that flame. That fire then spread through the cable, which had a connection into the areas of the plant that were supposed to be isolated, and it led to a fire in a very significant part of the plant. In what's called the cable spreading room, which if you imagine a big nuclear power plant, there's a room where all these cables come together and they all go out to different areas in the plant. So it spread to that area. So you lost a lot of things. Now, if you go back to those criteria that I talked about how you do good nuclear regulation, single failure criteria, one thing that can't take out everything. Will a flame on a candle or some other device that takes out cable, starts a fire on a cable that goes to your cable spreading room that controls all the power, all the instrumentation for all of your equipment, you have a single failure criteria, right? You have one single way to wipe out everything and your ability to control the reactor. That was something when they developed these criteria they didn't think about. That was a single failure criteria that was missed. So as a result, we had this fire. The fire was eventually put out. There was a lot of discussion about how to do that. People didn't know. You had electrical equipment, cable housing, all these kinds of things burning. People wanted to put water on it, but at that time there was a lot of discussion, is water a good thing or a bad thing on electrical cabling? But that was the capability they had to put the fire out. And eventually, after it burned for a while, they did. And that was it was unknown what the consequences were going to be from that, but they did it eventually. They put the fire out, and no real significant issues were happening. So I'll just skip. I kind of went through this. So that was an example of, okay, we have a system. We think we've done everything in the right way, but then sometimes there are things that we miss. And there have been really 3 now fundamental issues in this deterministic traditional approach to nuclear power that have taught us significant lessons. The first one in the United States was 3 Mile Island. The second one in 1986 was in Chernobyl. And then the third now that we're still in the middle of is in Japan. An interesting anecdote about, I love these covers, in particular the very first one, which is the 3 Mile Island. There's an interesting feature of this. Ever since 3 Mile Island, people associate nuclear power plants. Maybe I'll make this interactive. What do you associate a nuclear power plant with? I'm sorry? The towers, right. The cooling towers that are in that picture. For those of you who have ever visited nuclear power plants, not all nuclear power plants have cooling towers, and not all cooling towers are at nuclear power plants. But that is the canonical image for a nuclear power plant, and a lot of that comes out of 3 Mile Island, because these are the images that people were showing. This big cooling tower, now the cooling tower really has almost no connection with safety significance. And I have to tell you, I had this conversation with my parents about 3 months ago. They went on a vacation, and I won't tell you where. And they drove by a power plant, and it had cooling towers, and they called me up and they said, "Oh, we just drove by, one of the power plants you regulate." And I said, "Well, no, you didn't." And they said, "Yes, we did." And I said, "No, you didn't," and because I knew where they're on vacation. And they said, "Well, yeah, we saw those big cooling towers." I said, "Mom, how many times have I told you? Not all nuclear power plants have cooling towers, and not all cooling towers are at nuclear power plants." But it shows. I bring that up as an important point because there's a lot of misinformation about nuclear power that's out there. And it's no more demonstrated by that image. Every time people think of nuclear power plants, that's what they think of. That's not really the nuclear power plant. Now, Chernobyl was a very different type of experience. It was a very different design and a very different approach to nuclear power than we have in this country. So there weren't necessarily a lot of things that we learned from that. The Japanese design is a design that's more similar to plants in this country, so we expect that there are going to be lessons that we're going to learn as a result of what happened. So I paint this picture of this approach to regulation that we think is a good approach, but then there have been some problems with it. There have been some errors, some things we didn't anticipate. Now, again, if you go back to 3 Mile Island, and I talked about those ideas of defense in depth and redundancy, those things did work at 3 Mile Island. Ultimately, no radiation, no significant radiation was released from the nuclear power plant. You had significant damage to the reactor fuel itself, and by damage we mean that basically the stuff melts, and when it melts it can release material, the radioactive material. That didn't get out because you had this big containment structure at that reactor, and that containment structure did its job. So there was important lessons, but ultimately the system generally worked. But we're a very conservative regulator, so we like to make sure we don't even get to the point in which we have like this damage to the reactor fuel. So we wanted to learn to see how we could prevent that kind of a situation better. So we came up with a new idea, which was to start to think about and use the burgeoning tools that were out there to try and get beyond the ideas and the problems that we could dream up, and to start letting computers help us with that. And to start figuring out, and in particular with this idea of single failure criteria, figuring out where the vulnerabilities are. Sometimes what we thought the vulnerabilities weren't always right. But with these sophisticated computer models, we can start to begin to put a better idea and to see how systems talk to each other, and how the fault in one might have an impact on another in a way that we can't just do by looking at an analysis independently. So this is the beginnings of what we talked about as risk-informed regulation. But a very important piece that came out of this, and these numbers are not necessarily totally accurate at this time, but general order of magnitude. And if you go to this chart and you look at the bottom line, you look at this is just an estimate of different types of risks and the hazards from these kinds of things. So you look at the top, it's motor vehicles. And the approximate individual risk of early fatality probability per year. So the chance that from one of these things you're going to die is about, and this was, again, this was back in the 1970s, was about 1 in 10 to the minus 4. For those of you who aren't math, that's about 1 in 10,000 chance that you'll have a fatality from a motor vehicle. Most of the things that are on here, they're in increasing orders. And again, these are very old numbers. You get down to hurricanes, tornadoes, lightning is up here. Most people think of getting struck by lightning as an incredibly rare and unlikely event. And not only that you get struck by lightning, but that you would die from it. Now, it does tragically happen. But the numbers we had at that time from 100 nuclear power plants, which is about what we have in this country right now, showed that the chance of you dying from something happening at a nuclear power plant was 1,000 times less than the chance of you getting struck by lightning. So even with everything we knew, and even with this kind of incomplete system, we had these numbers which showed that there's still an incredibly unlikely event that you could ever have something significant happen from a nuclear power plant. And it's important, even as we look at the terrible situation in Japan right now, that we're not aware yet of anyone who has died from radiation exposure as a result of the accident. I mean, there have tragically been some fatalities of workers that we're aware of right now, and it appears to be that that was a result of the tsunami itself, and they were working in the plant, and when the tsunami came through, it killed at least 2 people. But from the radiation, we don't have any indications of a direct fatality from the radiation. Now, there are some workers who have been exposed to higher levels of radiation. They may have an increased risk of cancers or other types of diseases. But again, that we don't have definitive information right now. So what we knew in 1975 is that, and again, these numbers were challenged, and there was, this was the first time this was really done. So it wasn't the most rigorous at the time, but it started to give us some perspective, okay, of where do these kind of risks fall and what do they mean? So skip ahead another 10 years. The commission then wanted to start to take this information and put it into a way that traces back to that idea that I talked about, that our job is reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety. So we came up with something that we call our safety goals. So this was an attempt to say, what does that reasonable assurance of adequate protection really mean? Okay, we know from these risk studies that the perception of nuclear power and the risk of nuclear power may not be consistent with what the real risk is. It may be a lot less than the perception. So how do we take that and try and quantify it and come up with some kind of approach so that when we do that reasonable assurance of adequate protection, we know how to kind of figure out if we're meeting it or not? So the commission came up with these safety goals, which to this day are extremely, I think, useful and important. We did it in a qualitative way because, as you can see, it's very difficult to kind of calculate these things. And what we said is that individual members of the public should be provided a level of protection from the consequences of nuclear power plant operation such that individuals bear no significant additional risk to life and health. So we think right now the system that we have in place accomplishes that. As you saw from that first chart, that the risk is really much lower relative to the other kinds of risks and hazards that people may face. And then that societal risk to life and health from nuclear power plant operations should be comparable to or less than the risk of generating electricity by viable competing technologies and should not be a significant addition to other societal risks. So again, a way to put this in the context of the other kinds of risks that we face. So that was the qualitative look. The quantitative piece is perhaps a little bit more meaningful. The results from a reactor accident should not exceed 0.1% of the sum of prompt fatality risks resulting from one accident to which members of the U.S. population are generally exposed. So 1/10 of 1%. So if you think about 1/10 of 1%, that's getting you about that factor of 1,000 difference from all those other risks that I showed you on that previous chart. So that was a quantitative way to say, okay, this is what we mean. If we've got these tools where we can start putting numbers here, maybe we can come up with some criteria that use those numbers and rely on them. Then the second one, so that first one is really about the prompt action. And again, as you've seen and you've watched what's unfolding in Japan, this is an event that's unfolding over several weeks. And radiation is being released over a long period of time. That first bullet gets to what happened immediately. If there was a large release in a very short period of time, those radiation levels that could be hazardous, immediately hazardous to your health, would be very close to the plant, would happen over a very short period of time. And so that's what that first quantitative objective tries to get to, is let's minimize the chance for that happening. Well, the physics to some extent takes care of that. It's very hard to get a large release that would have enough radioactive material that would cause a prompt fatality anywhere other than very, very close to the reactor itself. So then we get to the next issue of these health objectives, and that is that the risk to the population in the area of a nuclear power plant of cancer fatalities that might result from nuclear power plant operation should not exceed 1/10 of 1% of the sum of cancer fatality risk resulting from all other causes. So again, we should be several orders of magnitude, or 1,000 or so more, less likely that you would get a cancer that could lead to your death from exposure to radiation from a nuclear power plant. And that includes accident conditions or normal plant operation. Now again, with the system we've developed, we think that these things are very easy to meet. Or not easy to meet, but that are met and that can be. So since then, we've done other things to further refine and utilize these tools, and I won't go into it in great detail, but the basic idea is this whole industry has been developed called probabilistic risk assessment. It was largely developed to put a better understanding and a face on what are the real risks of nuclear power. And risk analysis is something I'm sure you deal with in the work that you do here if you're dealing with industries and particular hazardous industries and the actions of those industries. But that concept of risk analysis and this triplet of generally what we mean by risk analysis is two things. It's the likelihood of something occurring and then the consequences of that occurring. So if if you're faced with a situation of where do you spend scarce resources, you want to put your resources where they're going to have the most impact. So, and this is often something that people mistake about risk analysis. It doesn't mean that you ignore the low likelihood events. It means you have to understand what the consequences of those are. If you've got a low likelihood event that has very little consequences, that may not be the most important place to put your money. If you've got an event that has a high likelihood of happening and medium consequences, that might be much more important. Where the real interesting questions come in is when you get in these high consequence, low probability events. That's where the real interesting questions are. And that's what this tries to do with this risk-informed approach, is to say, is there value in trying to address that? And so that's what risk does. It gives you a way to compare it. It takes the apples and the oranges and makes them all kiwis or something. So it says, here's a way we can compare things. Here's how we can compare, the chance, if you think of an analogy maybe, for your home, the chance that, is it more important to spend money to make sure that you have a better stove so that you don't create a fire on your stove versus somehow fireproofing your entire house for the unlikely event that you're going to have a lightning strike that's going to cause your house to burn. Where's the best place to put your safety money? And it's not always intuitive. Without these tools, we didn't have a basis to try and compare those things. But now we can compare those things, and we can say, okay, well, what happens if I have a fire on my stove? Is that going to likely lead to the whole house burning down, or will that be easily contained? Is my kitchen all made out of brick, and there's no way that anything in the kitchen's ever going to catch on fire? Then, okay, I get a fire in the stove, and eventually it'll burn itself out, and it's not a big deal. If I have an all-wood kitchen, that may be a very different situation. If I have an all-brick house, or if I live in a place that doesn't have lightning, then I don't have to worry about lightning. So I don't need to make my house lightning-proof.
It's all those kinds of decisions that with these sophisticated models, we can get a much better understanding of what really is going to happen and compare these two in a way that we can then make smart decisions with how to spend the safety money. So if we look at today, we've developed a system that's much more rigorous and much more focused on this kind of risk approach and risk analysis. And this is just an example of, or just a visual of the plants that exist in the United States. Right now we have 104 operating nuclear power plants. Most of them are on the East Coast. Most of them are in the Northeast and the Southeast, and then a cluster kind of in the Midwest. We have a few plants on the West Coast, but very few. This is our job, is to make sure that these things stay safe. And all of these things I've talked about kind of lead us to today and how we can continue to do our job in the most efficient and effective way, to continue to make sure that nuclear power plants are safe, and we do it in the right and a smart way. And we don't miss things that we haven't thought about. Right now, we're at a very interesting time because we have these 104 operating nuclear power plants. We have 5 new designs that the Commission is currently reviewing. As I said, we have 12 applications for possibly 20 new reactors. You're anticipating a cost of about $6 to $10 billion for each plant. The Department of Energy has a program of $18 billion to provide loan guarantees for construction of new nuclear power plants. And then we have something at the bottom that are called small modular reactors. So generally, the concept has been bigger is better. Economically, you minimize certain systems, you maximize the power output, you're going to recoup your costs in a more efficient and effective way. Well, if you look at that $6 to $10 billion for each plant, a lot of that cost, an additional cost that's in there, has to do with the financing of these large projects. Nuclear power plants take time. They take time to go through the licensing. They then take time to build. And when you're building them, you're not generating any electricity, and you're not generating any revenue. So your financing costs are a significant driver for the overall cost of a nuclear power plant. So the idea with the loan guarantees is to help subsidize that and make those costs slightly lower. Now, that's not a program that we administer. That's the Department of Energy that does that program. But the idea with these small modular reactors is if they're smaller, they take less time to build, so you can begin generating an incremental amount of revenue in a much shorter period of time. So from a financing perspective, they make more sense. Now, it's not clear in the overall economics that that does make sense. It's the competing difference between having people drive to work, everybody in their own car, when they're all going from the same place to the same place, versus putting all of those people in a bus. In some cases, the bus is probably more efficient and effective. The jury is still out whether this idea of building these small modular reactors will be economically cheaper. Now, again, the obvious attraction is it allows you potentially to begin a plant earlier without the time it would take to build a large reactor. So we're in this situation right now. Now, this was a slide that I have used before. Now the interesting piece that gets thrown in is what happens as a result of Japan. What is that going to do to this dynamic? So I'll skip ahead to that situation. I'm sure all of you have seen this and are familiar with what's going on. There was an earthquake and then a tsunami in Japan. It impacted several, actually, nuclear power plants in Japan. One of them in particular experienced some challenges because they lost all of their electrical power. And again, if you go back to these risk studies and these risk analysis that we've done, that's a situation that we know is a very significant situation. These models show us that this kind of condition is really a very significant challenge. And so that's what we've seen is this play itself out in Japan. These are the 4 units right now that are under most interest and most concern at the site. But I would just note that there are 2 other units. This one site has a total of 6 nuclear power plants. And you'll notice, of course, there's no cooling towers. There are 2 units at that site as well. Those units are stable and are not being challenged right now. So there were some units that had problems, but not all of them. So there's some good lessons there as well. We want to try to understand why those in particular didn't suffer the same kinds of consequences as the 4 that are right now of most concern. One of the challenges that we've seen is this so-called hydrogen explosion. The basic idea is that if you have this nuclear fuel in a power plant, the basic idea with nuclear reactors is fairly straightforward. You got to keep a lot of water on this fuel. You keep water on it, you keep it cool, you keep the radiation levels down. I mean, that's basically the idea. If the water level gets below, and this fuel is like pencils, they're like thin rods, pencils that are long, about 12, 13 feet long. The water level, as it comes down, if you lose that water, okay, and when you lose all of your electric power, you lose the ability to keep water in that core. Eventually, it evaporates, it boils, and eventually then it steams off. And as that steam builds up, you build up pressure. That pressure needs to be released. And then in the early phases, if you were watching, you saw that they were periodically venting steam. That steam had radioactive material in it because it was coming from the reactor. If you get down to a level low enough where the water is below that fuel, that's what we talk, you'll hear a phrase if you're listening carefully, top of active fuel. That's a significant phrase. When the water level gets below that, which means it's lower than the fuel itself, that fuel can get very hot, and it can get hot enough to melt or to have some other kind of damage to it. And when that happens, you get different kinds of chemical reactions. And one of those chemical reactions takes some of the hydrogen that's in the water and makes hydrogen gas. Well, hydrogen gas can be very combustible, can explode. Gets concentrated, you have all the steam, you have all these other things, pressures building up, that hydrogen can get compressed, and then it can explode. Okay? And that's one of the things that we saw with one of these units. Again, these are known phenomena. These are known issues and known challenges. So what the important lessons that we'll want to look at here is how did the systems that we have designed to deal with this fail? How did they not do what we wanted them to do to minimize the risk of this hydrogen combustion? And so you see, this is just a picture of one of the units. If you look at the top, whoops, at the top here, this is the unit 1. That's where it had the hydrogen explosion. And then if you look, there's a yellow kind of marker. This is what was the top of this building right here. So that was completely lost. And with it is equipment and inability to manage the reactor. So that was a significant event in this. So some of the tragic pictures of what happened, and this was several days later. The NRC provided a team of experts that went to Japan as part of a US government effort to help analyze and address the situation. And as we go forward, we intend to do a lessons learned. We're doing a short 90-day review of what's happened, and then we'll do a longer-term review as we get more detailed information. I'm going to try and skip to the last so we can save some time for questions. So I'll just close generally by talking about the future. You know, one of the, as I said, if you go back to the very beginning of what I said, we are fundamentally a creature of Congress, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we're very attuned to what Congress is thinking and doing. We have a brand new Congress with a House that's now Republican controlled versus democratically controlled. There are probably no grand approaches to energy policy that will be coming out of this Congress. It will more likely be specific kind of piecemeal approaches to nuclear or to energy policy. And the fundamental thing to keep in mind with almost any energy issue is that it's regional and it's generally not partisan. Democrats who come from West Virginia like coal. Republicans who live in the Northeast where you have acid rain, well, it used to be called acid rain or whatever they call it now, and have all those pollutants from the Midwest plants that produce the coal kind of blow over to the Northeast and then deposit material. Republicans from the Northeast don't like coal. It's fundamentally a regional issue. It probably always will be a regional issue. Republicans in the West where you have lots of wind resources like wind, you know, Democrats in the Southeast where you don't have wind, like it. So it's generally not strictly kind of a, you know, the answers tend to fall more on regional lines, which is what makes energy policy such an interesting issue for the Congress. But I tend not to like to say too much about Congress because you can never know exactly what they're going to do. But fundamentally for us, safety's got to be the number one priority, and will continue to be the number one priority for what we do. Where we will go from here, I showed you that chart of the possibility for new licensing. It'll be very interesting to see. Our job is to make sure plants are safe, and that the plants, if they're licensed, are safe and will be safe to operate. We're going to take lessons from Japan, and there will be lessons for sure. We're going to apply those, and I want to do that in a way that's systematic and methodical. If we do that well, then I think everything else will ultimately take care of itself. So, and I can't help but put in a plug for the agency. We generally come out on surveys as the best place to work in the federal government for large agencies. I should make that distinction. We've done that 3 years in a row. I suspect that eventually we will stop getting that, because that's just the natural cycle of things. That probably will happen while I'm chairman. That's just the luck of the draw.
I don't know a lot about nuclear power, but I hear things about the fact that nuclear power generation produces nuclear waste, spent fuel rods and contaminated water, and I don't even know what else. What is the world's solution for dealing with the waste that's produced by nuclear energy generation?
There isn't one right now. I think, well, I should say there's not a long-term solution. It's a very controversial subject in this country. It's a very political subject in this country. The general idea, I'll give you, kind of a 30-second primer on high-level nuclear waste. Basically, this is material that has the potential to be radioactive for long, long periods of time, possibly hundreds of thousands of years. So very early on, there was a fundamental decision that was made, which was that if we're going to deal with a 100,000-year problem or a million-year problem, we need to deal with systems that are 100,000 million-year systems. Those are not, right now, human systems. I mean, man-made systems, right? Because we don't have experience with any natural or man-made system that is human-made system that is, more than 10,000 years old, or whatever you want to pick for your number. So there was a decision very early on that was made that you have to deal with systems that operate on these kind of timescales. Well, those are geologic systems, the Earth, basically. The Earth operates on those kind of timescales. Rocks, there are some geologic formations that are stable over hundreds of thousands of millions of years. So the very early thinking was, well, okay, well then that's the solution. We take, a system that needs some kind of stability over that time frame. The only thing we know that is stable over that kind of time frame generally is some kind of geologic structure. So the idea worldwide has been put this stuff in a repository, a geologic repository. That's what the phrase means. It's something that is stable over that kind of time frame. The challenge has been finding something like that. As my geology friends remind me, geological systems may be stable over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, but when they fail abruptly. And the Japan earthquake is an example of that. That may have been a fault that had been stable for hundreds of thousands of years. When it failed abruptly. So in the long term, everybody thinks geologic repositories are the right way. They just haven't figured out a way. They haven't figured out a place that works. Some countries are farther along, but they're countries that don't have large nuclear programs. So the issue really is then, kind of right now, that we think we understand. The question then becomes, is there a short-term problem? I mean, until we figure that out, until we find a place that's acceptable to everybody for that long-term approach, is there an issue in the short term? And the simple answer is there really isn't. Spent nuclear fuel, while it is extremely hazardous because of a radiation exposure perspective, it does not, it is a well-contained and easily contained material. It's not like CO2, for which it's extremely difficult to try and capture CO2 once it's emitted. It's a gas. It's very hard to capture that CO2. The spent fuel is contained in these rods, and it's stable. It has high radiation levels, but all you need to do is put enough concrete between you and that material, and you don't have a problem. So in the short term, there isn't really a huge challenge from a health and safety standpoint. There are challenges with the management, with the ultimate economic liability, these kinds of issues. But fundamentally, from a safety perspective, there really isn't. So the answer, I mean, the short answer is we don't really have an answer, but we don't really have a problem either. And that's, I think, what's sometimes forgotten is we have a lot of discussion politically. If you read the papers about Yucca Mountain, and I personally have all kinds of scars in that debate. But fundamentally, I see that as a solution in search of a problem. From the NRC's perspective, we just don't see spent nuclear fuel as a fundamentally challenging safety issue. It's a easily dealt with from a safety standpoint, and that's over decades, probably 100 to 200 year time frame, which is a very, very long time. So we don't have an answer, but to some extent we don't really need one right now. What we're doing works perfectly well and is a reasonable approach.
We're all mourning the loss of William Donald Schaefer, who was the former mayor of Baltimore, governor of the state of Maryland. He was certainly the cheerleader for Baltimore's economic development efforts over many, many years. And I would be interested in your view of whether or not you have a comparable role with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to assure the public that provide a calming influence. Fear is out there. People are afraid of the fear of God. They're afraid of the fear of nuclear energy. And I wondered whether or not you feel a responsibility, you and the other members of the commission, to provide a calming influence and a leadership role in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it is our job to make sure that people understand what we do and to make sure that they understand what our views of nuclear power plants are. And right now, those views are that the plants are safe. And I think it's important for us to communicate that to the public if they have concerns. Absolutely, I think that's a fundamental role for us. But it's also for the agency to say if we think that there are areas that people need to be concerned about. It's our job to say that as well. But when there isn't something to be concerned about, I think it's important for us to make that clear.
You've referred to the potential loan guarantees that are available. And I know I read yesterday where NRG has just taken 2 nuclear reactors in Texas off the table, proposed, and they all seem to revolve around the lack of confidence or the process in securing these guarantees. I know you said the commission is not directly involved in them, but
and not even indirectly. I probably should have said that too.
Well, should the commission be indirectly involved in trying to stimulate the Department of Energy to, quote, get their act together so as to provide the comfort level that the private sector needs so that those dollars are available? The
short answer is no. I think when we were created specifically to be separate from the Department of Energy, precisely so that there wouldn't be any even perception that the commission was playing a role in promoting the power plants that we regulate. Was one of the issues that really challenged the Atomic Energy Commission near the end of its time and led ultimately to the split. So I think it's a split that's worked effectively and ultimately, to get back to your first question, gives us the ability to make those objective and clear determinations about what we think is happening with the plants, whether they're safe or there are challenges. And we can do it with the public knowing for sure that we have no vested interest in the outcome of those decisions.
It seems that the loan guarantees have sort of stayed off the table regarding the certain budget cuts lately. Are you seeing that too? And also regarding COL approval for the reactors, hopefully later this year in South Carolina and Georgia. Do you think those will be pushed to the right as sort of this 6-month long-term review? Or do you feel like the new passive generation technology is far more advanced than what was installed at Japan, to where you sort of covered all the bells and whistles regarding possible COL approval later this year?
Well, on the first point, the loan guarantee, I have to be honest, I haven't really followed what happened in the budget with the loan guarantee program. I'm not sure. I know there was an effort to get additional resources for it. I'm not sure if they did, in all honesty. With regard to what will happen with the new reactors that we have under review, right now our plan is to continue working on the schedule that we're working on. I think it will depend on ultimately what changes or kind of lessons we learn from Japan, whether that will have an impact on these designs. certainly with the sites that you referenced, there are some features that would appear to be able to mitigate some of the situation that we've seen, namely that these plants don't rely necessarily on all the electrical equipment in an accident condition to kind of move water around and keep the reactors cool. But I don't, right now, I mean, it's possible that there will be some changes that could cause us to reevaluate those designs. We'll just have to wait and see what comes out of the reviews. But right now, our plan is to continue to move forward with the reviews on the schedule that we're reviewing them now, and to do these lessons learned in parallel. And if there's some changes we need to make, then we'll make those changes as we go.